The air in the Mount Sinai emergency room didn't carry the rhythmic bass of a New York block party. It carried the heavy, sterile scent of finality. On November 8th, 2011, the world didn't just lose a voice. It lost a mountain of a man who had spent decades carrying the invisible gravity of a secret. Dwight Arrington Myers, known to the world as the overweight lover, collapsed not from the lifestyle he projected, but from a sheer exhaustion of being what everyone else needed him to be. As the monitors went flat, a haunting question rose from the silence. How does a man who gave the world so much peace, love, and happiness die with a heart so burdened by things left unsaid? The rumors had whispered for years about his health, his isolation, and the fading light in his eyes. But as the screen fades to black, we realize the tragedy wasn't just in how he died, but in the quiet, lonely confirmation of the struggles he spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The Mount Vernon of the 1970s was a landscape etched in concrete and ambition, a place where the air tasted of exhaust and the distant, rhythmic thrum of a culture beginning to find its heartbeat. In the center of this urban symphony stood Dwight Arrington Myers, a boy whose presence was as undeniable as the summer heat. While other children moved with the jagged, nervous energy of the era, Dwight moved with a calculated, fluid grace that seemed to mock the very laws of physics. To the casual observer, he was a beacon of light, a charismatic youth with a smile that could dissolve the tension of a city block. But beneath the velvet texture of his laughter lay a foundational wound, a quiet, desperate architecture of the soul built to house the insecurities he dared not name. He was a boy who learned early that in a world of predators, one must either become small and disappear or become a giant and lead. Dwight chose to become a king, but the crown he forged was made of a heavy, invisible gold. This was the birth of the heavy D persona, a meticulous psychological construct designed to serve as a sanctuary for everyone but himself. He watched the streets with the eyes of a master conductor, realizing that his physical stature could be weaponized as a punchline by others, or he could transform it into a throne. He chose the latter, weaving a narrative of the overweight lover, a figure of such immense charm and agility that his size became a symbol of abundance rather than a mark of health. In the dimly lit basements where he practiced his craft, the mirrors reflected a young man navigating an era of grit with a heart that remained stubbornly soft. He was planting the seeds of a legendary career, perfecting the nimble footwork that would one day mesmerize millions, all while burying the quiet, persistent anxieties of his own physical mortality. He was a boy trying to prove to the world, and perhaps to the reflection in the glass, that gravity was a suggestion, not a rule. Yet, as the rhymes grew sharper and the basement tapes began to circulate, the physical cost of his performance began to whisper. It was a faint sound at first, the dull, rhythmic ache in his knees after a night of dancing, the way his breath caught his throat just a second too long during a high-energy set. He shielded these moments from his peers with the skill of a veteran actor, retreating into the heavy D character whenever the man, Dwight, felt the strain. He was becoming a hero of the hustle, a psychological titan who carried the dreams of Mount Vernon on his shoulders. But the more he built the legend, the more he neglected the vessel that carried it. He was a master of the stage, but a stranger to the silence of his own body, convinced that as long as the music played, the reckoning could be postponed indefinitely. The night of his debut at the Apollo Theater arrived with a cold, electric tension. The legendary stage was bathed in a harsh, unforgiving light, waiting to judge the boy from Westchester. Dwight stood in the darkness of the wings, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that felt less like excitement and more like a warning. He had promised his mother, the woman who saw past the persona to the fragile boy beneath, that he would see the specialists, that he would finally address the lingering weight in his chest. He had nodded, he had smiled, and then he had buried that promise under a mountain of ambition. As the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers and the crowd roared in anticipation, a sudden, sharp tightness seized his breath. The shadow of a medical reality he had chosen to ignore stood right there with him in the dark. watching as he prepared to step into the light. The curtains parted, the beat dropped, but for a terrifying second, Dwight wondered if his heart would allow him to finish the first song. Fame did not knock on Dwight's door. It arrived as a conqueror, dismantling the quiet life he once knew and replacing it with the neon glare of a global stage. As the 1980s gave way to the 90s, Heavy D and the Boys became the architects of a new sonic movement, injecting a relentless, shimmering optimism into the new Jack swing era. While the hip-hop landscape was often defined by a jagged hardness, Dwight moved through it like a silk thread through denim. He was the overweight lover, a title that was both a stroke of marketing genius and a psychological prison. Behind the platinum records that began to line his walls like cold, metallic mirrors, the polished exterior of the superstar was beginning to show minute, microscopic fractures. The world was falling in love with a character, and Dwight was becoming the secondary occupant of his own skin. This was the paradox of his peak. The more the world celebrated the jovial giant, the more the man named Dwight felt himself receding into the shadows of his own success. He was no longer just a musician. He was a CEO, a visionary, a brother, and the primary provider for an ever-expanding circle of dependents. These roles demanded a constant, unwavering performance of strength and joy. Even when the lights dimmed and the roar of the crowd faded into the hum of a limousine, he could not drop the mask. He was the emotional anchor for an entire industry, a man whose presence signaled that everything would be okay. But in the sterile silence of his dressing rooms, the air often felt like an ocean, heavy, pressurized, and increasingly difficult to breathe. He was drowning in the very atmosphere he had created to keep everyone else afloat. The psychological toll of being the overweight lover was a weight far greater than any physical measurement. He was acutely aware that his brand was built on a specific aesthetic, a large man with the grace of a gazelle. To lose the weight was to risk losing the brand. To keep it was to risk losing his life. It was a cruel, circular trap. We see him in these private moments, the camera lingering on the exhaustion in his eyes as he sits before a makeup mirror, the festive colors of his wardrobe contrasting sharply with the gray fatigue of his spirit. He began to seek out secret consultations with doctors, slipping into medical offices under the cover of tinted windows and aliases. The warnings were always the same. His heart was working overtime, his blood was thickening with the stress of his schedule, and his body was begging for a pause. But Dwight would listen with a polite, distant smile, thank the doctor, and then walk back out into the roar of the world, dismissing the warnings as hurdles he could simply outrun. He was a man surrounded by thousands, yet he moved through a profound, hidden loneliness. He was the architect of everyone else's joy, but his own was becoming a scarce commodity. He spent his nights managing the egos of rising stars and the logistics of a burgeoning empire, burying his own physical discomfort beneath the needs of the boys and the demands of the label. He was the sun in his own solar system, but the heat was beginning to scorch him from the inside out. The chasm between the public icon who danced with effortless joy and the private man who sat in the dark, clutching his chest, was widening, a silent earthquake splitting his identity in two. He believed he was invincible because he had to be. He believed the foundation he had built was made of stone. But the universe has a way of reminding even the strongest architects of their fragility. Just as he reached the absolute pinnacle of industry power, becoming a mogul who sat at the right hand of legends, the air was suddenly sucked out of his world. A phone call in the dead of night brought news that defied his control and mocked his influence. It was a sudden, devastating loss within his inner circle, a tragedy that didn't care about platinum plaques or public personas. As he stood in his mansion, the silence finally becoming deafening, Dwight realized with a chilling clarity that even the strongest foundations can crumble in an instant, and the mountain he had built was beginning to slide. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it a cold, digital sterility that seemed to drain the saturation from Dwight's world. The vibrant primary colors of the overweight lover era, the bright yellows and exuberant blues of a million music videos, faded into the muted, monochromatic tones of a man standing at the threshold of 40. The industry's pulse had quickened, shifting toward a harder, more cynical edge that left the pioneer of peace, love, and happiness navigating an unfamiliar transition. This was the deep darkness phase, a psychological retreat where Dwight began to pivot toward acting, seeking a new mask to replace the one that had become too heavy to wear. But beneath the new scripts and the tailored suits of a character actor, a sense of profound existential dread was taking root, growing in the quiet spaces between his lines. The rumors during this period were not born of tabloid scandals or public meltdowns. They were softer, more haunting whispers about a man who seemed to be disappearing even as his physical presence remained imposing. We see him in his private study, the room bathed in the amber glow of a single lamp, surrounded by the ghosts of his own success. He was struggling with a body that no longer obeyed the commands of his will. The fluid grace that had once defined him was now interrupted by a labored rhythm, a respiratory whisper that he learned to hide behind strategic coughs and long, contemplative pauses. He felt a crushing sense of guilt, a silent, internal scream, because he could not fix the mechanical failures of his own heart with the same surgical precision he used to fix the careers of the moguls he had mentored. This was a cinematic descent into isolation. Dwight became a ghost in his own life, pulling back from the social circles he once anchored. He was terrified that if the world saw the effort it took for him to simply stand, the myth of Heavy D would evaporate. He lived in the quiet room of his own making, a psychological bunker where the only thing louder than the industry rumors was the relentless, rhythmic ticking of a clock he finally realized he could not stop. He was haunted by the fear that his legacy was tied to a physical vitality he could no longer sustain, a realization that turned his private moments into a psychological battlefield of identity and mortality. The end of this era was marked by a long-haul flight back from London, a journey meant to be a transition toward a new chapter of international work. As the plane hummed through the thin, pressurized air of 30,000 feet, Dwight sat in the dim cabin, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his weary eyes. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain stabbed through his leg, a jagged, electrical betrayal from his own blood. It was a physical manifestation of every secret he had kept for 40 years, a silent clot born of stasis and long-ignored warnings. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles turning white, as the pressure in his chest began to mirror the pressure of the cabin. He was miles above the earth, trapped in a silver tube, finally realizing that the secrets he had buried were now rising to meet him. The end did not arrive with the cinematic crescendo of a final stage performance. It came with the muted, rhythmic struggle of a man walking a mundane Beverly Hills sidewalk on a bright November morning. The California sun, usually a symbol of success and clarity, felt oppressive as Dwight climbed the stairs toward his home. Every step was a negotiation with a body that had finally withdrawn its consent to be a vessel for the overweight lover. This final chapter reconstructs the tragic clinical finality of his collapse, a moment where the legendary grace failed him and the gravity he had spent 40 years defying finally claimed its due. As he slumped against the railing, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps, the world around him continued to move with an indifferent pace. The subsequent confirmation of a pulmonary embolism, a silent traveler from that London flight, provided the cold, medical answer to the rumors that had whispered in the shadows of his career. He wasn't just tired. He was broken by the very circulatory system that had once fueled his legendary footwork. From this sterile, clinical reality, the narrative pivots into the spiritual rebirth of a legacy that refused to stay buried. The news of his passing rippled through the industry not as a headline, but as a profound seismic shift. We see the titans of the industry, men and women like Sean Combs and Queen Latifah, figures who stood on the shoulders of the mountain Dwight had built, rendered small by grief. In the grain of the documentary footage, their faces tell a story of a man who is the secret architect of their own confidence. The outpouring of emotion was a collective realization that Heavy D's life was a sustained sacrifice of the self for the joy of the collective. He had been the overweight lover so that they could be stars, He had carried the weight of the big brother archetype, so they didn't have to feel the coldness of the business. The rumors were finally confirmed, but they were more human than anyone had dared to imagine. He was struggling, he was exhausted, and he was profoundly, beautifully human. This is a poetic reflection on what it truly means to be a heavy soul in a world that increasingly values the light, the superficial, and the fleeting. Dwight's weight was never just physical. It was the gravitational pull of a man who felt everything too deeply, who took the pain of his community and the pressures of his peers and wore them like a tailored suit. In his vulnerability, uncovered only after his final breath, he finds a new, more resonant kind of immortality. He is no longer the caricature on a lunchbox or the nimble giant on a music video set. He is the patron saint of the selfless, a reminder that the loudest smiles often hide the quietest battles. The documentary draws to a close not on a funeral march, but on a slow-motion, ethereal shot of his signature dance. The frame rate slows until every movement is a brushstroke of light against a dark background. In this digital afterlife, Dwight is finally weightless. The sweat, the labored breath, and the stabbing pains are gone, replaced by a fluid, eternal motion that transcends the limitations of the flesh. He is finally free from the gravity of his own heart, dancing in a space where expectations cannot reach him. The music swells, a soulful blend of New York grit and heavenly melody, filling the room until it feels like the walls themselves might breathe. But as the final notes begin to decay into a haunting, resonant silence, a chilling thought lingers in the air, unbidden and sharp. We are left to look at the empty stage and wonder. If he had shared the crushing weight of his burden sooner, if he had allowed himself to be the one who needed saving, would that great, gentle mountain still be standing today?